Nkosi sikeleli Afrika maluphakanyiso tumo.
This is Steve Zeltzer with Workweek, and we have had the past meeting of BRICS, which is a economic alliance in the world, China, Russia, other countries, Brazil. And they met recently in Johannesburg in South Africa, and there was much hullabaloo about this economic alliance being a challenge to the US-dominated IMF and other world trade organizations. And is this a real challenge? And what does it mean for the working class and the environment in the world? And joining us is Patrick Bond. He's a professor, University of Johannesburg, and he's written recently a long article about the real nature of BRICS and what it means for climate and the working class in Africa and the world. So welcome for joining us, Patrick.
Thanks, Steve, and all the comrades viewing us. Thank you for having me.
And first of all, what is BRICS and how did it develop, this economic trade organization?
Well, the origin is a term, BRIC, Brazil, Russia, India, China, that a man called Jim O'Neill, an investment banker from Goldman Sachs at the time, subsequently a member of the House of Lords and a minister in the Tory governments of Britain. He kind of came up with the notion that the 21st century would have new economic drivers, and he thought Brazil, Russia, India, China were going to be those drivers based on their commodities, their manufacturing, and the potential for new rounds of capital accumulation as the West, for that period of the 70s, 80s, 90s, had periodic slowdowns and depressions and banking crises. And so in 2001, his paper has been cited thousands of times, sort of saying these will be the winners. And in 2007, in Ekaterinburg in Russia, Vladimir Putin pulled them together, those four. And then in 2010, at a meeting in China, the Chinese leader, Wen Jiabao, said, maybe we should bring in an African country. And it was logical to bring in South Africa. At that time, South Africa was run by Jacob Zuma. And Jacob Zuma was in the more left populist tradition of the African National Congress, as he ran against the incumbent Thabo Mbeki to take control of the party in 2007 and then take over the government in spite of some 880 corruption charges that were already leveled against him for a French arms deal a decade earlier. But he got those pushed out of the way, as these things often happen, and came in and was delighted to bring South Africa into the BRICS. And that was in late 2010. And by 2013, these annual meetings had reached an extremely, let's say, overblown stage. And I can very clearly remember the first one that was hosted in South Africa. It was Durban, the third largest city, Jacob Zuma's main home base. And it was an extraordinary moment for hyping a post-Thabo Mbeki South Africa that was going to be punching into the world above its weight, as usual. After Mandela, from 94 to 99, President Thabo Mbeki was hosting many events and, trying to have an African Renaissance, a new partnership for Africa's development. And Zuma used this opportunity to say, well, instead of moving into the multilaterals, we'll move with the opponents. And the rhetoric at the time, because Putin had, after his Vienna speech in 2007, begun to de-link from ambitions to be, for example, in NATO, as he once articulated in 2000, and to be part and parcel of Western capital. And by 2014, that had reached the moment where invading Crimea got sanctions, got him tossed out of the G8. And at that point, we could really see Jacob Zuma as a sort of caricature of a sort of some would use the term neo-patrimonial or corrupt patronage-based leader. Now, in China and in Brazil, with Brazil, of course, moving from Lula to his chosen successor, Dilma, by 2014, she was in crises. In 2016, she was unfairly impeached. And then in India, the crucial moment, 2014, was when the Congress movement, the traditional sort of center-left movement with some non-aligned aspirations, they were replaced by the BJP, the Hindu nationalists of Narendra Modi. And so there was a big shift to the cultural right and also a pro-corporate right. So it looked like from 2014 those who'd invested hopes that there might be a left push within BRICS began to be much more circumspect. 2014 was also the most important year of the BRICS for their annual meetings, because in Brazil, under the hosting of Dilma and Fortaleza, they decided that they would really put into action what had been articulated, some new institutions. And the two that came up, Stephen, were the financial alternatives, they said, to the World Bank and the IMF, the BRICS New Development Bank, the NDB, which is now run by Dilma. She was appointed by Lula, newly elected again in early 2023, to run Brazil. And so he's kind of had the power to replace the existing Brazilian president of the New Development Bank. And so it's Dilma, with lots of left-wing rhetoric, but as we'll see, not much in practice. And then there was also a contingent reserve arrangement to augment the International Monetary Fund. Now, when you look under the hood and you actually say, well, what are these institutions really doing? Then it turns out, from when they were really launched in 2015, the CRA, the alternative to the IMF, has never existed. And we really needed something against the IMF during COVID, because South Africa went to the IMF for a $4.3 billion loan, replete with austerity and neoliberalism. But the main point is that not just did that CRA not exist, this BRICS New Development Bank was a bit of a sham as well. It was supposed to be an alternative, but we would argue, and I have all the evidence to back this up, that they actually amplify most of the worst tendencies of the World Bank. And then finally, there were plenty of other moments where the BRICS said they would do things. In 2018, again, second big summit here in Johannesburg, a COVID, well, this was 2 years before COVID, wasn't it? It was a vaccine center that was going to be the BRICS Center here in Johannesburg. COVID came in early 2020. It came, ironically, from one of the BRICS, from China, from either, if you like, the lab leak thesis, or if you like, the zoonotic disease thesis, whichever, but it's coming from Wuhan in China. And yet the Chinese put together 2 vaccines pretty quickly. The Russians put together one. And yet the lack of vaccines, the inability to cooperate. And of course, the other big factor was Jair Bolsonaro, the Brazilian, from 2019. He took power, and then in 2023 was replaced by Lula. But he, during his period, sabotaged anything that the BRICS might do. Now, I'm giving you a bunch of sort of moments or data points of interesting, let's say, features at the fairly granular level. But the overarching sweep of the BRICS was a peak of expectations until not only that 2014, the change in India, but also it was the peak of the commodity supercycle. So 3 BRICS began to slump, and those were Brazil, Russia, and South Africa, the main commodity exporters. So the BRICS went into this sort of period of not doing very much, aside from these big conferences and lots of, sort of annual meetings where they had aspiring statements. And in 2019 to 23, they were useless. Now come 22, under Bolsonaro, they couldn't move. And now comes 2023, and everything's changed. And it's not just because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which created more fissures in the sort of geopolitics and economic relationships, and the big sanctions and the dollar freeze of assets, and the SWIFT, the interbank trading system ban. But also there was a whole set of controversies about the way South Africa would host. And the 2 crucial questions would the de-dollarization that everybody's been sort of expecting to move, since the US dollar has so many irrational features as it's imposed on the world. We can talk about, I happen to work at the Federal Reserve for a couple of years, so I've, a total critique of that institution on the one hand, and also an expansion of BRICS on the other. And so that brings us to last month, August 22 to 24, high expectations, but aside from 6 new members of the BRICS, no delivery on the de-dollarization agenda, and a sense that the BRICS are growing, but we're divided into probably 3 big camps about how we understand them. Some think it's going to be fantastic, and the hype, you get this from governmental statements and some of the most enthusiastic anti-imperialists, plus gold bugs and cyber currency dealers who want a lot of churn. And secondly, there's a more measured group who'd say, we have hope. At least there's weakness now in the US, and this presents another pole of power. And then there'd be a third group, which I would put myself in, that would be explicitly critical of what the BRICS are trying to do, because I don't think they talk left and walk left. They talk left often in their articulations of critique of existing power, but they walk right because they're still very much a part of that power structure. Corporate neoliberalism, multilateral institutions, and the expansion of a very predatory form of capitalism.
Well, it was planned as an alternative to U.S. imperialist-dominated economic groups, but actually, for example, the entry of China into the WTO. What did that lead to in South Africa as far as the working class was concerned? Because there was an earlier effort by U.S. imperialism to bring China into the WTO, into this economic structure. What does that mean for the working class of South Africa and the world?
Well, it's very much the framing that I prefer, which is that imperialist Western manufacturers found that they could gain a higher surplus value extraction by outsourcing. And it was to initially in the 70s and the 80s, places like North Carolina, or, you know, this next wave in the 80s were the maquiladores on the Mexican border, and then to East Asia. Now, that process certainly expanded the scope of capital. This is globalization, maybe in its peak era of closing down factories, rust belts, and deindustrialization, not just in the United States, but in Western Europe, and the integrated value chains that bring especially East Asian and Chinese, ultimately in the 90s, and especially after they joined the WTO in the early 2000s, right into a sub-imperialist relationship. So no longer is the surplus value process one in which the point of production exists in a place where you might have a strong enough labor movement, say in the 40s, 50s, well, after the 30s upsurge, to actually claw back some social democracy and to have some sort of safety net of social policy. And the West could do that because of labor movements and, to some extent, political parties that made those kind of priorities. I think of a book called The Three Worlds of Welfare Capitalism by Josta Esping Andersen, a Dane who really puts forward a class analysis that I found very useful for scoping out that period in the 20th century. But as capital could then move to new shores after it overproduced, overaccumulated its capital, looked for a spatial fix, it moved the problem around geographically and found even more production, no unions to speak of, no problem with environmental and safety and health violations, very low wages, a migrant labor system in China that looks very much like South African apartheid, that is the hukou system of rural workers who don't have rights when they're in their factories in the cities, the same as urban workers. And that cheapens the labor force and puts much more obligations on the rural women to do the reproduction of the social labor. Now, those processes, I'm sure all of your working class audience will agree, meant that Western workers' wages stagnated and fell. The jobs that were well paid and well unionized in manufacturing collapsed or moved. And what the South African working class found is that they were very much like the West, because our rate of industrial development was very rapid during the 30s, during a period of World War, and even before that, the Great Depression, because now here down at the bottom of the world, instead of importing, because it was much more difficult with U-boats or world financial squeezes, now South Africa industrialized, and black wages actually went up enormously in that period. In the 70s, our workers, especially after Durban strikes in 1973, where many in the Bay Area were connecting into through the longshoremen, the Wobblies, are all sorts of connections that were very important in getting that solidarity. A book by Peter Cole links Oakland, San Francisco dock workers with Durban dock workers beautifully. Now that process meant worker wages finally got up to the point where you could really live in a city and demand that the urban working class could actually have their wives, their children with them, instead of in these distant Bantustans under migrant labor. Now, then comes the 90s, and that's, as you say, the devastating moment for deindustrialization, when the new competition, because South Africa joins the WTO in 1994, and therefore we lose everything that is, let's say, quasi-protected or small-scale production runs, they're just swamped by the East Asian imports. And that would be clothing and textiles and footwear and leather goods. It'll be appliances and electronics. All of the big labor-intensive sectors were really hammered in the 90s, and we lost an enormous amount of the industrial proletariat and the confidence which had been rising to the point of sweeping out apartheid and saying we actually do want socialism. That was a very common sentiment. You can't just get rid of apartheid and have capitalism. You need to sweep out migrant labor, class exploitation, the entire way in which the South African cities operate for the sake of capital, all of the things that make this place as profitable as it had been, the most profits in the world for multinational corporates in the heyday in the 70s. And the other crucial factor was gold, which the US had allowed to move up very high because of US inflation before the Federal Reserve put the interest rates up. I hope we have a moment to come back to that moment. I wasn't working in the Fed in 1979. I worked there after I graduated from university. I had a huge debt. I was at a little college in Pennsylvania, and I said, oh, I've got to get a proper job. So I put on a suit and went to the Fed, and I could see the squeeze that my colleagues were engaged in, called the third world debt crisis, by having put the interest rates up. A guy called Paul Volcker had really, I think, probably economic violence, maybe, unnecessary death of people in Africa that exceeded what Cecil Rhodes or King Leopold did. Now, that period of the 80s, the debt crises, and then the deindustrialization of the 90s finally took it out of the working class. And so much of our very strong militant trade union tradition here was eroded in that period, especially when many of the most talented, eloquent, and committed leaders were, well, frankly, co-opted. They were brought into the parliament, a few of them into the top ministries. I happened to work for one in President Mandela's office. He was a minister responsible for reconstruction and development. His name, Jay Naidu, a wonderful guy, but at the time, he was just moving from being a militant socialist leader of the Congress of South African Trade Unions, well over 1 million members, to becoming the minister in charge of development. And I was writing the first policies for the South African government, could really see firsthand this class struggle becoming a class snuggle. And that meant that the, let's say, militancy of that trade union movement was undermined. But I definitely would put a fair bit of the blame on the failure to protect at least some of the industries that could have had a potential later for more redistributive or backward, forward-linked economic prospects, especially things like clothing and textiles and appliances and electronics. Those would be 4 of the most desperately needed industries here, especially if we could use critical mass here to export to the rest of the continent. But again, I'm talking about it like if I were a reformed industrial capitalist, but those forces were pushed out by the neoliberal financial capitalists.
And the apartheid regime used contract labor in the exploitation of the working class in South Africa. The contract labor system seems like it's coming back with the privatization of public resources, not just in South Africa, but Namibia. So it means the destruction of organized labor. Is that what's happening in South Africa and in Southern Africa?
Oh, yes. And the dilemma is that the core to profits were not only the traditions that you're describing. David Harvey, my PhD supervisor, terms this accumulation by dispossession, just taking state programs, shrinking them, taking worker privileges, taking state-owned enterprises and privatizing them. But also what Rosa Luxemburg, when she first wrote about South Africa in 1910, the book Accumulation of Capital, having read people like Olive Schreiner or John Hobson, she was reading, she never visited, but she could feel how capital would penetrate, not only to do extraction of labor, destruction of indigenous systems, again, putting more pressure on women, but particularly nature, and that is the extraction of our mineral base. And we have an enormous base. In fact, it's still measured at over $12 trillion worth of platinum group metals, still some residual golds and a few diamonds, iron ore, manganese, and coal. Coal, of course, we need to desperately keep underground, but PGMs, these platinum group metals, were the big hope because not only were platinum catalytic converters important for allegedly until Volkswagen and BMW and Mercedes cheated the system, but for reducing emissions, but also in the new green hydrogen, as they call it, the sort of use of solar power and wind power to break water into hydrogen, use the hydrogen. You need to put it into a cell for its energy potential. And that's battery would be also using rhodium and palladium, part of the platinum group metal. So there's an enormous potential, even just north of us in Zimbabwe, lithium in large quantities. I happened to do a little bit of a tour of the mines of Zimbabwe. And now, in many of these cases, Steve, this extraction, going back to Cecil Rhodes and the diamond fields in Kimberley, then the Oppenheimers and the tradition of the gold landlords, as they were called, here in Johannesburg. Half the world's gold at one point was under my feet in this city. And so vast amounts of wealth have already been looted. And that is the largest, I think, process of extraction and super exploitation of this country. Of course, with workers, 40,000 black mine workers having died in the process. But maybe I should just conclude that part by asking, in this process, we could always blame the likes of Cecil Rhodes or the Oppenheimers, or J.P. Morgan worked with Harry Oppenheimer to get Anglo-American going. All of these, big multinational British and to some extent U.S. capitalists. But as they faded, and many of them have denationalized, in other words, Anglo is actually now found in London, and even Anglo Gold Ashanti, which was headquartered here, just moved out last year. They've moved to London. Now, these denationalization processes of white capital mean that the field is open for a variety of new mining extraction and fossil fuel extraction firms. Of course, you're always going to get Shell, Total, ExxonMobil. Those are ringing around on our offshore fields. But we're also finding Chinese companies. So I was in Zimbabwe, and everywhere I went, from gold near Mutare to diamonds in the Marangi fields, the biggest field since Kimberley, down to this big lithium deposit in Mashvinga, up to an iron ore mine. In a circuit that I did with the Center for Natural Resource Governance, you could really just feel that extractivism or predatory mining from China. And it was 4 big Chinese companies, and they would just really loot the raw materials. There was no prospect for beneficiation. There may be with a big new steel mill if they actually do build it, but these are some of the processes that I think mean there's a sub-imperial, not an anti-imperial or even inter-imperial relationship that we see in our deep economic relationships. And I can go through many examples here in South Africa of where Chinese extraction, especially with corrupt allies, whether they be companies, the Gupta family, or state and parastatal officials. So we often will find, unfortunately, Chinese capital right at the center of some of the worst predatory activities. We saw that also with Rosatom, the Russian state-owned nuclear company, trying to sell about $100 billion of energy, nuclear energy, that was resisted by environmentalists successfully in 2018. We've seen it with Indian companies. The one that's most controversial today is Jindal. We've seen it with companies that you know well going up into Namibia as well. Brazil has companies like Odebrecht, the construction companies full of bribes in Angola and Mozambique, Vale that came into Mozambique and looted the coal. In case after case, our BRICS companies are behaving very badly, and I could go into much more depth about what South African companies do in the rest of Africa. It is really shameful. And that, to me, Steve, means the attempt to posture that a new relationship with alternative companies and maybe new institutions like a BRICS bank is somehow going to be less extractive, exploitative, predatory, destructive than the Western neo-colonial arrangement. It doesn't look that way at all. It looks like they're fitting in, they're not working against it.
And this effort to predify, make it's a real alternative to the development of Africa and other countries, Asia, Latin America, that Chinese investment will be better for the working class and the people and the environment. You're saying that actually that ideology that's being put forward, or propaganda which is being put forward, is not the reality. That it actually, the development of Africa, for example, is going back to imperialist agenda, which is just to get the resources, build railroads, and build infrastructure in order to get the resources out, and not for the development of indigenous industrial development. Is that what you're saying in Africa is going on?
Yes, exactly. And we could go on with scores of examples. And the maybe most prominent labor case in which both labor and natural resources in the Rossing uranium mine in Namibia does have a Chinese owner, and unfortunately inability to unionize and very extractive, exploitative conditions. And the dilemma is that across the continent, one is feeling the extent of desperation, the debt crises, the uprisings that between 2011 in January, when Tunisia blew, and then in February Egypt blew, and you could really feel a rhythm, not just an Arab Spring in the north, but all through the continent, uprisings of social movements. Now, those rarely, if ever, succeeded. Some of the most tragic, for example, in Sudan in 2019, led to the kind of conflagration between two military factions that's killing thousands as we speak. Or in Algeria in 2019 as well, an overthrow of Abdelaziz Bouteflika, an old corrupted nationalist regime, but no better. And in Tunisia, a very right-wing and racist government. And in Egypt, we know that after an election that had the Muslim Brotherhood win, then a US ally, the El-Sisi regime has come in first with a coup and then an election. Now, again and again, especially the last few weeks in West Africa, in Burkina Faso, in Mali, and then the last few days in Niger, and just this week in Gabon, the pressure cooker means that the military says, well, we can take over. And I saw this very closely, Steve, in Zimbabwe. In 2017, Robert Mugabe had sort of come to the end of his tether with the Chinese. And he'd actually gone out in 2016 and said, look, we had $15 billion of diamonds in the West, in Marangi. And this is this huge diamond field. And 800 or so people were murdered by the Zimbabwe military and police when they cleared that field of artisanal miners in 2008. And then the Chinese were the main beneficiaries, as long with Israelis and Indians, Belgians, those who are part of the value chain of diamonds. But what was critical is that Mugabe actually said, look, we had 15 billion of those diamonds, and we can only account for 2 billion. So 13 billion has disappeared. Now, he said that very openly. His sort of mantra after becoming very stigmatized in the West for his land invasions in 2000 after he lost a referendum. He pushed very hard to clear the white settler farmers off the land. About 3,000 farmers were displaced, and he came under sanctions. But he then looked east. But then he said in 2016 that wasn't eventually going to get us the retention of our surpluses. And I think my point is here, when you see the pressure come up and you see a coup, and in the case in November 2017, the number 2, a guy called Agostinho Chibangwa, went to China just the week before. And Mugabe sensed something was up and basically banished his vice president, whose name was Emerson Mnangagwa. And then Mnangagwa and Chiwanga got together, and a big army push, clearing away the police, supported by at least 100,000 people in the streets in November of 2017, pushed Mugabe out. So he finally agreed to resign. Mnangagwa comes in, and things have gone downhill from there. I mean, it's just an extraordinary tragedy that when that popular sense, oh, great, the old bastards are out. Let's see if we've got something new and fresh. But unless the system has changed, just that little replacement at the top, I think that might be the way our allies in Gabon are going to be looking at the new regime that's just taken over from the dreadfully corrupt outgoing regime. But it again and again suggests that if we're looking at power politics and palace coups or pressure cookers that bring a coup, it's just the beginning of a story where liberation and ecological sensibilities and feminism and all of the values that we think are inherent in this continent can actually be realized.
Well, you see in Niger that the U.S. has drone bases. The United States has AFRICOM all over Africa. They're intervening, and the French has the colonial relationship in West Africa, where for uranium and other resources, France is controlling them, and also the people of Niger have to use a French currency even though the French themselves use the euro. So this role of U.S. and French imperialism, of colonialism, is, I mean, it's part of the imperialist control of Africa, and part and parcel. But what you're saying is that apparently the Chinese investment in Africa is, of course, a colonial investment, not a real investment of for the development of Africa as a whole and their industrial base. Why don't you talk about the destruction of the industrial base of Africa, and how privatization and the corruption of the ANC is actually continuing the colonialization of Africa, and South Africa in particular.
Yeah, and I should stress, because what we were saying in West Africa was not so much mediated by BRICS capital, but increasingly it is in our region, even in South Africa. And if we look at maybe 3 or 4 quick cases, one would be the auto industry, where we had thought the Chinese First Auto Works and Beijing Auto Industrial Corporation would take advantage of the special economic zone that China had pioneered, and that they were promoting. Very low tax rate, it's 15%, and many concessions on imports and exports. So in a place called—
And that was Port Elizabeth area.
That's correct. Yeah, the new name is Kwabecha, and the particular zone is called Kucha. And there's a huge disappointment because of, notwithstanding major state subsidies from South Africa into Beijing Auto Industrial Corp, no progress. And with First Auto Works, in fact, BAIC actually has a huge facility, but they haven't been producing any cars. We're still trying to figure out why that investment. I think it's overaccumulation of automobiles at the global scale as a general explanation. The second is First Auto Works, where big labor conflicts. But if we move from that failed industrialization, which was ultimately a semi-knockdown kit. It wasn't even a full integrated assembly line, your sort of Rouge in Dearborn, Michigan. It was which we can do in this country. There is the raw materials that can go into a car factory, and out comes a nice car with lots of subsidies from the state. The second, I would argue, is the most destructive. It's the combination of the Medupi and Kusile coal-fired power plants. But there's a little let me say a small asterisk, which comes out much more positive for China on this. And the reason is these are the biggest coal-fired power plants being built. Still today, they're being built anywhere in the world, 4,800 megawatts each. So they pump out 30 to 40 million tons of carbon dioxide a year. They're vast polluters. And the energy mainly goes to they're called the minerals energy complex, or their nickname for themselves is the Energy Intensive Users Group. And this is 27 companies that use 40% of our electricity. And it's for deep mining, smelting, petrochemicals, and other highly capital-intensive industrial activities. Now, that massive use of electricity at a very low price compared to the rest of us. One company, the biggest mining house in the world, BHP Billiton, only pays about, it's currently at about 1.5 US cents per kilowatt hour. And we're all paying 10 times that. And when we began this discussion, my lights were out because of the blackouts that we get about today, about half the day. Now, the dilemma is when the Chinese go into these, they weren't building those, to their credit. This was a Japanese company, Hitachi, full of corruption. They bribed our African National Congress, but the Chinese provided financing, as did the BRICS New Development Bank. So one of the big questions is, should banks that knew that this was going to be a massive ecological disaster, an operational failure, complete failure to deliver, but also a corrupt project, because they all knew it from about 2007. Should we be paying them back? And the World Bank is our lead target on this kind of critique. The final case study then would be the way in which our locomotives were replaced, not local anymore, but imported from China South Rail in the early 2010s. Their names changed since then. They merged with China North Rail. But what happened was a family called the Guptas, 3 brothers, corrupted our state facilities, including Transnet, Eskom, the power company. But in going into Transnet, they made sure that these locomotives were massively overpriced on the Chinese contract so that China South Rail would provide the Guptas and their agents with bribes. And this has been, kind of well documented, and the people running Transnet are facing corruption charges and prosecution. The Guptas themselves ran to the United Arab Emirates. But the point about this story is that it was these Chinese South Rail plus China Development Bank under the rubric of the BRICS, with all of the promises that now interrelationships between South Africa and China would be much more compelling and effective and mutually beneficial. But it turned out to be the opposite. And the kicker is that the main reason for these locomotives coming from China was to increase our export of coal. And China started buying coal in 2019 in a very big way from South Africa. India is the #1 buyer. Germany has also picked up recently, but Chinese purchases of coal on these corrupted locomotives, which we're paying way too much for. And then a meltdown occurred about a year ago when the Chinese were hit with a tax bill they didn't want to pay. And so they are not actually providing the spare parts for these locomotives, which are now sitting idle. I gather there are 100 of them. And it's become a huge conflagration within our transport ministry and the public enterprises ministry, and even in South African Chinese international diplomacy about who's to blame and will China South Rail settle this tax bill. It's a big mess. And, all I can say is if you're an environmentalist, you've got to be thankful that we have much less coal going down that track because of the idled locomotives, amongst many other reasons. Now, the dilemma in all of this, Steve, is that if you love the idea that competition with Western capitalists, as we saw in the old Cold War, the USSR was always some kind of, alternative pole that you could play off, and therefore aid money from the West was prolific in that period. When the Soviet Union collapsed, aid money also dried up. And it was that sense, okay, maybe we do have another pole, a multipolar system that will give the African countries and the workers more choice and more potential. It'll be a little bit more fair competition. It turns out it's not working out that way. I think anybody who wants to look at what's happening on the ground honestly will say that this isn't about the competition between Chinese capital and Western capital, or the Chinese system, or the BRICS as a bloc, and the West. It's actually a well-integrated global assembly line in which the Chinese do most of the dirty work, whether it's research on gain of function bats and in Wuhan, and the U.S. companies take the R&D and take the sort of profits and royalties out of the system. And it's that imperial power and the sub-imperial relationships in this global division of labor, particularly enforced by international financial institutions, the World Bank and IMF, the BRICS, with the exception of Russia for more recent reasons. They had obviously been very much part of Russia, of the Bretton Woods before that. In fact, they even voted in 2015 to give the IMF much more money from Moscow into the IMF when the IMF recapitalized. So did China, so did India, so did Brazil. South Africa didn't have enough money and lost some. The losers, by the way, in 2015 in the IMF's recapitalization were #1 Venezuela and Nigeria at 41% decline in their share value. The BRICS kind of stand on poor countries' heads to get up to the high table, in a sense. And in that way, they're fully integrated and assimilated. And, last month I happened to be in northern China for a few days at a conference on poverty, and I was with the former World Bank chief economist, Justin Lin. And it was that sense that maybe there are some of the, let me say, assimilated intellectuals and managers who can be brought in. But the critical factor is who will run the IMF and the World Bank. And the critical question is, will the BRICS ever put up a candidate against typically a US appointed managing director of the World Bank, or president of the World Bank, and a European managing director of the IMF? And those are the sort of questions I love to ask my dear friends who say, oh no, we're going to challenge the world financial system as the BRICS will have more and more power. Now we have Saudi Arabia and Iran and UAE, Argentina, Egypt, and Ethiopia. We can now go into the IMF and World Bank and reform them. Well, no, you haven't done anything along those lines for at least 15 years. So why would we think anything will be different now?
And of course, the Gupta family, which was looting South Africa, paying off the politicians of the ANC, escaped South Africa, and they are being protected by the UAE, and UAE has been brought into BRICS.
It's extraordinary. And they also bought into the BRICS New Development Bank last year because the leader of the UAE, right, the chief sheikh, Sultan bin Simon, actually has a big ranch in South Africa, and he came for a whole month in I think it was May, June. He came with his retinue. He built a much bigger airport in one of the rural areas and flew in his mega jumbo jets full of whatever he needed there, and hung out for a month. And the rest of us in the country were saying, wow, that was an extraordinary, I mean, just literally weeks before, the UAE had let off the Guptas, but hadn't even told South Africa that this extradition request had been denied. It was just sort of in limbo. They weren't even communicating. The UAE, I just happened to fly through Dubai a few days ago, and it is such an extraordinary, financial wart on the world, coming out of the huge gas fields. And I should add that the leader of that extraction of gas from the Abu Dhabi National Oil Companies is Sultan Al Jaber, who's now been put in charge of the Conference of the Parties 28 of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. He's managing the climate conference this year. And it just, how much more absurd does this world get? How many more instances of very, very, let's say, aspiring, new emerging market? I mean, it's like having a Donald Trump in the presidency of the US. You just can't quite believe it. And this is the extent to which I would say, when you see the Chinese foreign minister just fired, his name was Gang, and just quickly replaced without any explanation, he sort of just disappeared. Or when you see Yevgeny Prigozhin apparently dead, try a coup and then come down in an airplane suspiciously. And then when you see in South Africa the turmoil in our politics, we nearly had our own President Ramaphosa resign last December. He was on the verge of quitting because he felt he couldn't handle the public pressure, because he put allegedly between $400,000 and $6 million into a couch, right? Stuffed it into a couch at his game farm, because he'd sold some buffaloes to a Sudanese guy who just kind of came in with cash. They never did the deal. Did he have to declare for exchange controls or taxes? Extraordinary questions of let's say the governmentality of elites and how they can maneuver through these things. So we're really looking at an exceptionally mediocre group of world leaders. The World Economic Forum itself will confess there's a poly crisis, multiple interlocking, overlapping crises that they have no clue as to what to do with: climate or pandemics or financial bubbling or geopolitical pressures or any number of other problems that the world elites can't manage. And now to think, and especially this coming weekend with the G20 in New Delhi, India coming up, that the G20 brings the G7 Western elites together with this new layer of emerging markets, which are not just the BRICS, but Saudi Arabia and Argentina. So the new BRICS Plus is now very well represented in this G20. And the attempt by Modi to manage this, where Putin has just pulled out, and now Xi Jinping has just pulled out, his own tightest allies from the BRICS are effectively saying, well, the G20 is not a space we feel comfortable. China and Russia, China and India having very, very serious conflagrations on their border and all sorts of other tensions. Now, that to me reflects, Steve, not an emerging new unifying, non-aligned movement, as some on the left would like, in that sense of hope that the BRICS could be, but instead a fragmenting and inchoate mess without a political, ideological core, and with one progressive leader, Lula from Brazil, really making no headway. And I think the most tragic reflection of this, if there's just one, it would be the de-dollarization fiasco, because with all of the hype and all of Lula's and Dilma's rhetoric about needing to increase local currency trading, maybe get a central bank relationship where accounts can be settled, but also to move to some sort of cyber currency or gold-backed currency, or some system in which the US dollar isn't as hegemonic as it must. And it just for 30 seconds, why do we hate the US dollar hegemony all over the world? Because the Federal Reserve, where I worked for 2 years, mismanages the dollar. And when it's Paul Volcker putting it up, the interest rate up so high that we get a third world debt crisis. And then the quantitative easing kicks in 2009 to 12, and then again 2020 to 21. Then the big US banks and Western banks get bailed out. There's all sorts of mechanisms, as we saw in, earlier this year with major bailouts in the US. But the rest of the world basically carries the burden of a devalued dollar. It's very cheap for the Fed to print the dollar. It's about 3 US cents. I have to work for that dollar, or especially if it's a $100 bill, the dollar denomination of choice. Now, the dilemma of all of this is that if the Fed loosens money, quantitative easing, prints the money, and then the next day, which starts in 2022, Jerome Powell puts the interest rates up, we're all getting the reverberations of this in an extreme way across the rest of the world. And you add that to this deregulatory fervor within the Fed, that the US banking system can do no wrong. And there's, even with some of the regulations that occurred after 2008-9, they've been denuded. And you just get a sense, Steve, that the United States doesn't deserve this. And the reason they got it is interesting. As I said, 1944, Bretton Woods, in New Hampshire, a big meeting, the Mount Washington Hotel. And basically 2 countries had all the gold, half of it in Fort Knox, the other half, more or less, under my feet here in South Africa. And that meant the US-South African alliance defeated John Maynard Keynes negotiating for the debtors. He was so upset, actually, after the second meeting, which was in Savannah, Georgia in 1946, he had a heart attack. And in fact, a second one that killed him a few weeks later. Now, the dilemma is if you set the system up, so $35 will buy you an ounce of gold, and that roots the dollar for decades and decades to come. How do you unravel it? Well, Nixon, the old US president, defaulted about $80 billion worth by saying, we're not going to pay you an ounce of gold if you bring us 35. Let's let that price go up and up because we have gold. We don't want to give it away cheap. So he defaulted. And the Bretton Woods, as a monetary arrangement and currency system, semi-linked to gold, came to an end. But the fact that the US had such extraordinary weight in the world economy, and the dollar was seen as such a lubricant of trade and investment and financial flows, and is a source of, let's say, value, or it's a hedge. It's a place where you put money if you're not sure what's going to happen to your currency. When there are big crises, even coming from the US, like in 2008, well, unfortunately, the dollar goes up because everybody runs to the dollar as a sort of safe haven. And those are the dilemmas of having dollar hegemony that I think we desperately, desperately need to end. We may need a full global conference to spread the burden of that monetary relationship. We may need some idea that no one's come up with yet to do it. But what we had hoped was that at least some inkling of the BRICS doing something. But here's where the real revelation to me is. It's that the conservative forces in our BRICS, like our Reserve Bank and Finance Ministry, and the same for the other countries, maybe with Russia as an exception this year, they don't want to change anything. And our central banker had been the head of the IMF Monetary Financial Committee, which was sort of the most responsible outside job you could have in the IMF. And it just kind of goes to show we're really not making progress until we change the balance of forces within the BRICS and lower that neoliberal weight that really compels our governments to do what the West wants us to. It's so bad, as the last point on this, that the BRICS New Development Bank, I mean, you can take your pick of punishments for Vladimir Putin's invasion, but financial sanctions were pretty effective. And in the sense that $650 billion was stolen by the West, shouldn't do stealing, private property rights are sacrosanct, but they did. And then the SWIFT system expelled Russians. And it was at that point that the Russians could have looked at their 20% ownership in the BRICS Bank and said, no, you will help us out now, right? Well, the BRICS New Development Bank, as well as the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, also based in China, they both said, no, we also join with the West in financial sanctions. And the reason there was simple. They looked to the credit rating agencies in New York, to Standard & Poor's, Fitch, and Moody's, much more than they look to the political class for their reification, for their validation, for their high credit rating. They did lose some of that credit rating, obviously, because they had a big chunk in Russia, and in June last year, Russia defaulted. But that really goes to show, I think, a sub-imperial mentality, a logic that's hardwired into our capitalist economy in South Africa and to some of the others as well, that Western circuits of power, governmental, multilateral, and especially financial, corporate, trading, manufacturing, all of those circuits of capital that bring a division of labor and a global value chain into focus, you will find a sub-imperial location that is, as Brazilian Rui Mauro Marini put it, allowing super exploitative processes internally and a deputy sheriff function internationally, even when that includes, as he put it, antagonistic cooperation. So there's obviously tensions. The circuits of capital have lots of fractions fighting it out for grabbing bits of the surplus within it. But the overall system is still in place as a world capitalist system. And I don't see, regrettably, even a discussion about breaking from it. Again and again in Sandton, our financial center where this was all happening, the BRICS leaders said, we're not against the West. We just want to make it fairer. And yet, in reality, everything they're doing makes it the opposite, especially when we add another 6 tyrants and carbon-addicted economies. Not all of them, Argentina obviously an exception. But when you look at some of the other new players, I don't expect this dilemma that I've described, a sub-imperial bloc location, to ameliorate or to improve. I think it's going to actually be amplified.
And of course, while BRICS was going on, it was announced by Ramaphosa government that they were going to privatize Transnet, the docks in South Africa, and the rails, that was a solution, bringing in foreign capitalists to supposedly renovate the industrial transportation system in South Africa. And of course, on the docks in Durban, you have contract labor, you have the attack on the working class, on the unions. What were the role of the unions in South Africa to BRICS and how they're being affected by BRICS?
Well, in 2018, there was a lot more engagement. The BRICS Trade Union Forum was quite active. I remember many discussions with leading trade unionists about whether there was any space for a genuine trade unionism. Of course, with the Chinese unions that were official unions, with Russian unions, basically supplicant by then. You really found by 2018 an ennui, a fear of moving in any direction. And this year I found absolutely no labor presence. So if you want to talk about the docks of South Durban, I know that area well because I lived there for 14 years and I know the community groups and the labor movement. And it was actually quite extraordinary, Steve, that the community groups in the nominally Indian and mixed race colored neighborhoods of Merebank and Wentworth, along with the African adjoining townships of Umlazi and Lamontville, and many of the small shack settlements, they actually joined a protest march against the BRICS. And there was a pro-BRICS group, mainly of ethnic Indians, people of Indian origin from the 1860 settlement of migrant workers and sugarcane indentured labor. And that group, certainly very loyal to Narendra Modi, felt, okay, we got to come and support. But the larger group of protesters included not only these community activists, and they were including, victims of Jindal, the big Indian mining house. And they had plenty of signs saying Jindal is wrecking our communities with their iron ore mining. But also Kashmiris came, and that was extraordinary to me. They're some of the most effective solidarity activists I've seen in this country, operating to find ways to raise consciousness and put pressure, including lawsuits that threaten Modi with arrest. They tried that with the Muslim Lawyers Association, a little bit more successfully in 2018 and also this year. Now, what it just means is the BRICS bring together, as if you recall, a Seattle in 1999, was it November 30th, or April 16, 2000 at the World Bank. I happened to be at that one. And you could really feel multiple grievances fusing as one big movement for justice, a global justice movement that was being described as some say anti-globalization, anti-corporate globalization. But I was beginning to get a sense, even with a sporadic set of protests here in Johannesburg, and then the protests I just mentioned in Durban, where the South Durban Community Environmental Alliance, they are so opposed to not just the degradations that they suffer in the main toxic hotspot of Africa, south of the Niger Delta in Nigeria. And that site, they've struggled. And they won Golden Prize awards, 2 of them, for very strong environmental justice activism. But they also struggle against transnet privatization and its expansion, because the circuits of capital in mercantile, especially, I'm sure all of your dock worker and longshoreman allies know this so well, much better than I do, but there are potentials for this, let's say, logistics industry to be disrupted. And those disruptions in Durban were formidable about 2 years ago in July 2021. Warehouses, the train lines, the roads looted, the trucks get looted all the time. It's a very vulnerable sector. It's like the sort of Achilles heel of the circuits of capital, where so much energy and attempts by global trading to find what end up being choke points, like ports, like the railroads that come from the ports, like the trucks that go up and down the big highways. And these are some of the most vulnerable areas. I therefore don't think the privatizers are going to go very far. And the reason is, in fact, they've been offered many chunks of Transnet over the last 2 or 3 years, and there frankly aren't enough profits. Even our big industrial logistics groups like Bidvest, they're just not picking up. The only 1 or 2 exceptions would be airports. So that might be one of the terrains where big private investors come in. The same debates are going on in energy and electricity. And at some point, and by the way, we had these debates in water, where Suez, a big French company, came about 23 years ago and came here to Johannesburg and took over for 5 years. But it was activists in Soweto, especially. Trevor Ngwani started the Soweto Electricity Crisis Committee. They worked on water, and they actually pushed out this huge French company. And I think that's part of our attempt now to think of a class struggle approach at the point of production, where labor and surplus value are extracted, but also in community and gender and environmental sites of struggle. Then they do sometimes fuse. And I feel that for the period ahead, if the BRICS do become a more coherent economic unit, then it's going to be terribly important for all the rest of us in the BRICS countries to start making even stronger links, the more we can, with the groups, whether the movement of landless workers and urban landless workers in Brazil, or in India, the National Alliance of People's Movements. In China, we had difficulties because in Hong Kong, the main network that we had was broken because of China's de-democratization of Hong Kong.
With Chinese capitals in charge of Hong Kong.
Yeah, and the dilemma there is that you had extraordinarily sophisticated anti-corporate activists and labor allies, and they are the ones who the Chinese government was fearing the most, and they've gone into exile or been put into jail for long terms. The same in Russia, where we had particularly important, in my petty bourgeois intellectual life, is the intellectual and academic and scholarly connectivities. And our probably single most prolific ally in Russia was just put in jail last month, Boris Kagarlitsky, in late July to be precise. And his charges, sort of fomenting terrorism because he reported on the destruction of the bridge to Crimea in October 2022. And it's just obviously coming to the point where someone like Putin is just no tolerance at all for a left intellectual presence. So we are definitely not going to have a BRICS from below counter summit, teach-in, analytical workshop, and protest the way we just did in Johannesburg when Russia hosts in 2024. But we'll find many, many ways to express solidarity, not just with Boris Kagarlitsky, but all of the other political prisoners who deserve, as they fight against the invasion, and as they also call forth some memory of a Bolshevism and a Russian tradition, maybe anarchism in some cases, that is so terribly important to the international left, and not allow that to be hijacked by Vladimir Putin, the man who hates Lenin so much that when he invaded Ukraine, it was partly to decommunize, as he put it, Ukraine.
Yeah, he attacked Lenin for supporting self-determination of the Ukrainian people, and said that was a big problem of Lenin, that the Ukrainians should not have self-determination.
But we can laugh, but the dilemma here, if you're in a place like Johannesburg and you look around for the major organizations of the left and the center left, there's some nostalgia or some sense that because Putin's being, fought by NATO, we have to support him. And this isn't trivial. These are the four biggest groups I can think of on the left, the biggest union, the Metal Workers Union, pro-Putin, pro-BRICS, pro-coal, the South African Communist Party with its nostalgia for the old USSR. The African National Congress has a radical economic transformation faction, the Zuma faction, pro-Putin, and even the economic freedom fighters, which are so pleasing in so many ways as a left force, about 10% of the support of the voting populace in the parliament, but have also come out pro-Putin. And when the big controversy was, would the West impose the International Criminal Court liberal standards that mean you shouldn't kidnap 20,000 Ukrainian kids and therefore you're guilty of human rights violations and war crimes, you should be arrested, and South Africa should take the responsibility as a member of the International Criminal Court of prosecuting that arrest, of arresting Putin. And of course, it couldn't have happened, but it left us from around February through early July completely convoluted with the gossipy personalistic aspects of this whole process at the very high level, along with a little controversy over whether Russia had uploaded some South African arms and ammunition back in December in a late night visit by a ship. And that became a diplomatic sort of controversy for a while too. What I'm just saying though is that we can get so caught up, can't we, in the kind of trivialities of diplomatic geopolitics and miss the geopolitical economy or the deep processes of capital accumulation, of class formation, and of the alliances within say blocks that are occurring in the world economy, not that are kind of characterized as the West and the BRICS, but instead the West and the BRICS together.
And Roy Singham, who has come under attack in the United States, American radical, who became a multimillionaire. And what has been his role in South Africa? And what is his influence among leftists such as Danny Haipong and Ben Norton?
I don't know anything about the operations that you'd find in Danny and Ben. I haven't met either of them. I sent Danny a little note, which he hasn't replied to, saying we should have a debate because he thought somehow or other that I had some broader influence when I used the term sub-imperialism. He didn't, they get very uncomfortable if you use terms like sub-imperialism to describe what they think are anti-imperial forces. However, there's been a lot written about Roy in South Africa, including in the New York Times, where a lot of people, maybe justifiably to some extent, think that there was a bit of a sort of McCarthyite smear of hit job and personalistic. I don't have a clear reading of your New York Times and what's going on there, but I can say that what I understand is the information in the New York Times article in August about Roy Singham in South Africa was accurate, and that there was a big mess about a year or so ago when he defunded a major e-zine, which was doing extremely good journalistic work. But over time, apparently, for example, in a story about rossing miners in Namibia, where Chinese exploitation of the workers was part of the original story, it was censored by the editor. This is the allegation by the journalist involved, who I find very reputable, Anna Majavu. And the dilemma is that when you've got a kind of major funder of that sort who appears, let me say, whimsical. I don't want to say there's some political agenda because I don't have any proof of why this e-zine was shut down, whether there was a financial problem of some sort. But the chopping of about 30 journalists was really reprehensible, and that included a non-disclosure agreement so they could get a small payout. Now, those kinds of tactics where you fund big very, very generously, and then you take it away all of a sudden, and then you put non-disclosure, and then there's a bit of a political cloud, and that then was amplified by quite a few articles and analyses. The ones that I find very, let's say, fair and balanced would be coming from the sort of there's a group called Amabungani, which is an investigative reporting team. But there are plenty of others out there, and you'll find in places like Monthly Review Online or some of the other e-zines, lots of debate over the past year about Roy Singham's role. He also played a role with the Metal Workers Union. He's played a role in having a retreat about 2 hours north of here, where good comrades from across the African continent come. And he played a role, allegedly, in a small political party, a sort of vanguardist party, the Socialist Revolutionary Workers' Party, only getting 25,000 votes, not even half the way to getting a parliamentary seat in 2019.
That was backed by NUMSA. That was NUMSA presented that as the working class alternative in South Africa.
Yeah, real tragedy, because we desperately need a workers' party, and the economic freedom fighters aren't as class conscious as they would like us to believe, and not cohering to Labour's agenda, where it's as left as it needs to be. So let's say that it would be wonderful to have a workers' party, but then the debate was, should you have a vanguard? And the leader of the metal workers, Irvin Jim, tends to be very vanguardist. On the other hand, another Labour leader, with by way of disclosure, whom I occasionally do volunteer work, as well as Nzima Vavi, he's much more into building the sort of united front approach that I would have thought, could have really had a chance, but it was stillborn. Even a united front movement within the metalworkers was sort of chopped from the top down. And the potential we had, you can imagine in the mid 2014, I think this is right after the Maracana massacre. It's when the conditions on the ground are getting worse because the commodity prices have collapsed. It's when Zuma's delegitimization has reached a peak because of the Guptas. So in the mid 2010s, the space was there for a genuine mass networking, a united democratic front, or united front it was called at the time. There are still some residuals of that, but it's a very tough time because the metalworkers and the overall union, which they moved out of COSATU to join, South African Federation of Trade Unions, have had many very, very debilitating conflicts, including the role of a wonderful president of the South African Federation of Trade Unions, Ruth Ntoklotsi, who had come from the metalworkers and then was a few weeks ago just fired from her position there. So these are things that, let's say, put a pall and a profound sense of depression on what we had thought would be extremely good vehicles for mobilizing not just workers in their sphere or social movements in theirs and environmentalists in theirs, but some sort of fusion. And for the time being, we're in a very bad way, where it looks like there's no immediate prospect of regroupment, of pulling together. But, we'll always be surprised. And who would have thought in Egypt or Tunisia in 2011 that big movements would come together and varieties of forces would find a common agreement, in that case, to get rid of their corrupt presidents, Ben Ali and Mubarak. But there may be a longer process. We have an election next year. And it may be that what happens is that the ruling party, the African National Congress, fuses with one of its main, its largest offshoot, the Economic Freedom Fighters, currently at loggerheads, but they may find a way to have a coalition government with a man called Julius Malema, the leader, very fiery, radical nationalist, maybe becoming the deputy president. And whether Ramaphosa would allow that remains to be seen. He would probably rather stitch together a few other parties as his partners. So we'll see what happens probably it'll be May 2024.
Well, the ANC did make a stitch-up deal with the EFF in Johannesburg to keep control of Johannesburg.
Not just here, but there were a few sites where, having lost in 2016 the municipal elections, major metropolitan areas, Gqeberha, Port Elizabeth, eThekwini, which is, they didn't lose Durban, that's the one they kept, Ekurhuleni, which is to the due east of here, the main airport center, Pretoria, the capital, Tshwane, and Johannesburg. So yeah, about 5 big metros have been zigzagging back and forth in control by the center-right led coalition, and then a few of their people are kind of picked off and they're brought back, and the EFF was the main one that would swing back and forth. It's an erratic organization, to be sure, but times change, conditions change, patronage systems change. The dilemma of let's say running cities, the city here is falling apart in all sorts of ways. Another big explosion just this afternoon after last week's death of 77 people in a terrible fire in what had been a very let's say, unregulated zone of the city, which a city-owned building had been hijacked by sort of landlord profiteers in terrible conditions across the inner city. The lighting and the water systems off regularly. And this is a reflection, I think, of how kind of, Frantz Fanon described this kind of politics as where there isn't enough room for a class to emerge to become a genuine national bourgeoisie. They have to do it through the state and the patronage systems that then are the source of conflict, not because of some big man theory or neo-patrimonial, as it's sometimes called, not because there's something to do with African governance, but because the class formation has been so stunted, and that this is really the sort of patronage or procurement systems, the tenderpreneurship tenders, the Black economic empowerment deals. It's really worth a lot in broader class terms, and it then boils down to sometimes internecine wars between micro-capitalists in different cities and which side they're going to be on. And sometimes it gets, in a place like Durban, quite violent with regular assassinations. So it's a very tough country to run, particularly when we are just a transmission belt in the broader extraction of our mineral resource wealth and extraction of surplus value.
And so on the question of BRICS, where did SAFTU and COSATU stand on the BRICS meeting?
Well, neither of them were vocal, I must say. I mean, COSATU's played a role since the early days. 2013, I think, was the first big meeting in which the BRICS Trade Union Forum gathers together trade unionists and they talk. And having studied that very carefully in the 2018 process, you could again find the dilemma that a lot of the, let's say, best minds of these movements go into crafting documents and putting together statements, but they don't really go anywhere. And they certainly haven't yet cohered to the point where the internationalism that we would have seen, say, Brazil, and South African workers in unity at different periods. I mean, to think that the current presidents of the South African and Brazilian governments were the leaders of their most powerful movements, the metal workers in Brazil, led by Lula, the mine workers in South Africa, led by Ramaphosa. So the extent to which we could feel the generations or the waves of organizing and the wisdom and the coherence of a proletariat in this middle tier of countries. You could add South Korea, you could add India, you could find enormously rich connectivities. And then some of the leaders take a very different route and basically chop off any connectivities that you could find in international proletarian politics. The same was true for the civil BRICS, which are the civilized society. I shouldn't be quite so, rude. Civilized meaning suit and tie, and you kind of go in as an NGO and you get a few crumbs. And there's a network, Oxfam's most closely associated with it, that does civil BRICS. It was even started in Russia in 2015, so a very low credibility level. The other networks that I find fascinating are academics. There's a BRICS think tank and an academic forum. But I mean, these are among hundreds of networks that are emerging, and yet they often take the appearance of expensive parties. And in fact, you can go on YouTube and find dancing styles from the different countries put on the stages for even academics. You can't imagine us dancing, but yeah, they'll even do that. And it, to me, is such a reflection of the failure of analytical nerve when my own people, my friends in academia, some of them are really great, but they really have to muzzle because they know that they're being paid. They're called think tanks, right? The BRICS think tank. They're paid to think by the people who control the tanks.
And of course, you put out in your article critiquing BRICS, the program of BRICS, and it's a capitalist program, which you clearly state in their words what they want to do. Yet this wasn't challenged programmatically by the unions, which themselves are affected by privatization and the economic agenda of capitalism.
Well, let me do an auto-critique. There are two ways. What I did was unfair. I cherry-picked. So I chose exactly 5 or 6 of the most egregious pro-capitalists. We want market-based agriculture. We want a stronger WTO. All of these kinds of things that you get from the more conservative forces. Firstly, and secondly, you could criticize me putting that out because it's so irrelevant. The documents and the proclamations and the statements, they never go anywhere. They're never popularized. It's really just a place where some of the technocrats behind the scenes get to write what they think is going on. But I put those points in my own defense because they are actually true reflections of what these BRICS are doing in reality. When they are in the World Bank and IMF, they are not fighting structural adjustment. They're imposing it. Right? When they construct a contingent reserve arrangement, alternative to the IMF, in fact, what they've done is said, okay, if you want to come in and borrow from the CRA, you can get 30%, but you want the other 70%, you have to get an IMF structural adjustment policy before we're going to give you the other 70%. It's that profound conservatism in the elites, in the middle tier of countries, which makes them so effective as sub-imperialists. The more they can talk left, they'll disguise this instinct they have to move to the right.
And one of the international capitalist enterprises, APEC, is going to be in San Francisco in November. I was in Beijing when APEC met, and I remember in the Chinese English press having articles from professors about how you can fight corruption by having joint management labor partnerships, in which private-public partnerships, in which that would ensure that you root out the corruption in the country.
Just on that, we know the PPP language so well, and it only means one thing: public-private plundering. I mean, it really is a way in which class formation, especially with parastatals, who are run by the new class and the old white guard in the big, kind of industrial conglomerates, are saying, yeah, well, we can still supply you with stuff. We're just going to mark up a little bit more, and we're going to pay some of it to you. In fact, the deal has been that the Black empowerment component of these kind of deals is often now 30%, and the delivery, sort of the connectivity of the state is there, but the actual, let's say, efficiency, it's so bad that even the Treasury about 5-6 years ago had a procurement officer, Kenneth Brown, and he put a report out. He comes from the movement. He's not a kind of white conservative. He said, look, between 35 and 40% of every contract, on average, the contracts that we give out is overpricing. That's the ripoff associated with the PPP, the public-private pilfering. No, it's actually, it's plundering, right?
And of course, APEC includes China as one of the partners. In fact, Blinken, Secretary of State, U.S., wanted Xi Jinping to come to San Francisco for APEC. It seems like it is similar to the WTO in its endeavors, and yet, how is that defended among the supporters of BRICS?
We rarely find the detailed level of these deals, especially done behind closed doors, sufficiently circulated. There are a few exceptions, and the most fascinating one to me was where just over a year and a half ago in the World Trade Organization, not even that long, it was June of 2022, the deal on vaccine intellectual property was not as we'd achieved 23 years ago in Doha, and it was 22 years ago in the Doha round of the World Trade Organization, 2001, an exemption, or basically a recognition that some emergencies like AIDS required generic medicines provided by the state, not by the private for-profit health system. And that led in this country to a rise in our life expectancy from 52 in 2004 to 65 just before COVID, where it is now. Now, that was because of activists, but we had so little activist coordination, maybe we were all shocked and we were all locked down in the period 2020 to 22, that by June 2022, two men really led the effort to get intellectual property waivers on COVID-19 vaccines and treatment. Narendra Modi, because of the huge pharmaceutical industry for generic production that India has developed, with Cipla especially. And secondly, South Africa. And that's partly because of this lesson that we'd had of, we can get generic medicines out through the state and save lives. So those two countries went into the WTO and got about 100 other supporters. What I didn't see was the behind-the-scenes debates that the Beijing and Moscow pharma corps, the ones that gave us, Sinovac, Sinopharm, and Sputnik, what were they having? They didn't want to lose intellectual property. Yes, they were giving out their medicines for free. There's a debate about efficacy. The Brazilians under Bolsonaro sided with Western big pharma. Even when Biden was pressured by his own constituents, as well as Emmanuel Macron were wavering. The key forces that kept those intellectual property restrictions were from Britain under Boris Johnson and Germany under Angela Merkel. And now things have changed a little bit, there are new leaders in these countries, but that to me is one of the, let's say, inchoate or schizophrenic characteristics of the imperial, sub-imperial, antagonistic collaboration. Because there you would really expect a global public good. Come on, let's get the vaccines out. I mean, they worked, right? And you need them spread throughout the world to the extent we can say public health systems suffered from vaccine apartheid, and we had many unnecessary deaths as a result. And we couldn't find in global elites and with the sub-imperial fracturing, even with all the rhetoric about a BRICS vaccine center here in Johannesburg in 2018, we couldn't find a space where the world could solve the problem of these awful divisions between different fractions of capital, really. We must watch what happens if this BRICS bloc goes to the United Arab Emirates and campaigns for more fossil fuels. And secondly, that the left, like in 1914, we don't have the luxury, or we shouldn't, neither did they then, of splitting in such an extreme way that we can't find the kind of detailed levels of solidaristic work together, because for some reason you believe BRICS is anti-imperialist or inter-imperialist or sub-imperialist. So one of the things I hope to do in the weeks ahead is to find comrades and opponents amongst those who consider themselves on the left and hash it out and see if we can avoid the sorts of unnecessary divisions over where our strategy will take us.
I want to thank you very much for joining us, Patrick. We've had a wide-ranging discussion on BRICS and the crisis of capitalism, and also the political task of the working class, what workers have to do to deal with this crisis and growing climate, economic, and social crisis, and the crisis of war. So thanks for joining us on Work Week.